Year is 71 BC. The air along the Appian Way, the great artery of the Roman Republic, is unnaturally still. This is a road built for the thunder of legions, the rumble of commerce, the pulse of a world-spanning empire. But today, its ancient stones are silent, bearing witness not to life, but to a vast and horrifying stillness. The clash of the Third Servile War has faded. The desperate 3-year struggle that saw a slave army bring the Republic to its knees is over. In its place is not the silence of peace, but the suffocating quiet of absolute, merciless victory. For a brief, terrifying moment in history, a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus had done the unthinkable. He had forged an army from the shackles of slavery, from the forgotten and the damned. He had shaken the very foundations of the world's greatest power and lit a consuming fire of hope in the hearts of the oppressed. But that fire has been extinguished, drowned in a final, brutal deluge of blood on the fields of Lucania. Now, for the thousands who survived the battle, a fate far more terrible than a swift death by the sword awaits. What was about to unfold on this ancient road was not merely punishment. It was a meticulously orchestrated spectacle of terror. It was a message to the world, a lesson carved into living flesh, designed to be seen, remembered, and feared for generations to come. To understand the sheer scale of the horror, one must first grasp the sheer scale of the fear that preceded it. The Roman Republic, for all its rhetoric of liberty and law, was an engine fueled by human misery. Its conquests had brought not just territory and gold, but people, millions of them, stripped of their names, their families, their humanity, and condemned to a life of servitude. They powered the vast agricultural estates, the latifundia, working from dawn until dusk under a merciless Italian sun. They were considered not human, but instrumentum vocale, tools that could speak. In the mines, they were driven into the suffocating darkness of the earth, digging for the silver and iron that forged Rome's legions and filled its treasuries. Their lives expended as casually as a lump of coal. They were a disposable resource, a silent, suffering majority upon whose backs the entire edifice of Roman civilization was built. And for the strongest, the most defiant, there was the arena. The gladiator schools, the ludi, were prisons of a different kind, cauldrons of violence where men were forged into killing machines for the entertainment of the masses. It was a life of brutal regimen of training, discipline, and the constant threat of a gruesome death for a cheering crowd. It was a life without hope, a slow walk to a guaranteed and violent end. It was from one such school in Capua, owned by the Lanista Lentulus Batiatus, that the spark of rebellion was ignited. A small band of gladiators, armed with little more than kitchen knives and a desperate, burning rage, overpowered their guards. Led by the Thracian Spartacus and the Gauls Crassus and Oenomaus, they fought their way to freedom. They took refuge on the slopes of the only defensible ground they could find, the dormant volcano, Mount Vesuvius, a sleeping giant that would soon become the crucible of their legend.
Rome, in its staggering arrogance, initially dismissed them. This was a servile war, a slave revolt, an annoyance, a matter for law enforcement, not for the legendary legions of the Republic. They dispatched a praetor, Gaius Claudius Glaber, with a hastily assembled militia of 3,000 men, confident that this minor inconvenience would be swiftly and brutally resolved. Glaber besieged Vesuvius, blocking the only known path down the mountain, content to wait for starvation to do his work for him. But Spartacus was more than just a brute forged in the arena. He was a brilliant and unconventional tactician. He saw a weakness where the Romans saw none. He ordered his men to weave ladders and ropes from the wild vines that clung to the volcano's cliffs. Under the cover of darkness, in a move of breathtaking audacity, the rebels scaled down the sheer, unguarded rock faces. They fell upon the unsuspecting Roman camp from behind, a phantom army emerging from the darkness. The attack was a complete rout. Glaber's force was annihilated. The unthinkable had happened. Slaves had defeated a Roman army. The victory was a shockwave that reverberated across Italy. The news spread like wildfire, carried on the whispers of slaves from one latifundium to the next. Seeing a glimmer of hope for the first time in their lives, they abandoned their posts, their masters, their entire existence, and flocked to Spartacus's banner. His army swelled from a few dozen to tens of thousands. Rome, now beginning to comprehend the scale of the threat, dispatched 2 consular legions, the backbone of its military might, under the command of the consuls Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus. Both were humiliatingly defeated. Spartacus's army, now armed with captured Roman armor and weapons, disciplined by their leader's genius, seemed invincible. They marched north, their goal perhaps to cross the Alps and find true freedom. In the opulent villas and the hallowed halls of the Senate, fear turned to blind panic. Slaves were not supposed to win. The natural order of the world was being challenged. This was no longer just an insurrection, it was an existential threat. The world had been turned upside down. Into this crisis of fear and failure stepped Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was the richest man in Rome, his fortune built on the ashes of civil war and shrewd predatory real estate. But wealth was not enough. He was a man driven by an insatiable hunger for power and a burning, bitter jealousy of his rival, the celebrated general Pompey the Great. While Pompey earned glory in foreign lands, Crassus saw his chance to earn his own triumph, not in some distant province, but here, in the heart of Italy. He volunteered to fund and lead a new army, and a terrified Senate granted him command of 8 legions. Crassus was not a military genius in the mold of Caesar or Pompey, but he understood one thing perfectly: the application of absolute, unyielding terror. When one of his legions broke and fled in the face of the enemy, Crassus revived an ancient, horrifying punishment: decimation. The disgraced legion was divided into groups of 10. Each group drew lots, and the unlucky soldier was then stoned or clubbed to death by his own 9 comrades. It was a lesson in collective responsibility and a demonstration that Crassus was more to be feared than the enemy. Fear, he believed, was a sharper sword than loyalty. His army, now forged in terror, became an instrument of his will. He systematically pursued and cornered Spartacus's forces, driving them south, away from the Alps, into the toe of Italy. There, in Brutium, he performed a staggering feat of engineering. He commanded his legions to build a 37-mile-long wall of earth and timber, complete with a ditch 15 feet wide and deep, stretching from sea to sea, effectively trapping the entire rebel army on the peninsula. Spartacus, now cut off, negotiated with Cilician pirates to transport his army to Sicily, but the pirates, likely bribed by Crassus, betrayed him and sailed away, leaving the rebels stranded. Though Spartacus and a portion of his army eventually broke through Crassus's wall in a desperate nighttime assault during a snowstorm, their momentum was shattered. Their hope was dwindling. Their end was now inevitable.
The final battle, near the headwaters of the Scylla River, was a slaughter. The rebel army, fighting with the sublime courage of despair, was utterly crushed by Crassus's superior numbers and iron discipline. Legend tells that Spartacus himself, before the battle began, killed his own horse, proclaiming that if he won, he would have many horses, and if he lost, he would not need one. He died as he had lived, fighting in the heart of the battle, his body lost to history, never to be identified. But for the 6,000 who were captured alive, their ordeal had just begun. Crassus, denied an official triumph by a Senate that still favored Pompey, decided to stage a military spectacle of his own, one that Rome and the world would never forget. The method chosen was crucifixion, the ultimate degradation, the punishment of a slave, a pirate, a non-citizen. It was a death of agonizing slowness, a masterpiece of pain and public humiliation. The logistics themselves were a statement of power. Legionaries were tasked with felling trees and constructing 6,000 heavy wooden crosses. A veritable forest of death was prepared. Along the 200-kilometer stretch of the Appian Way, from Capua, where the revolt began, to the very gates of Rome, Crassus ordered the crosses to be raised. They were spaced evenly apart, a man on each side of the road, for mile after agonizing mile. Grotesque avenue of the dying, leading directly to the heart of Roman power. Imagine the sounds. The rhythmic, sickening thud of hammers driving iron spikes through flesh and bone. not once, not a dozen times, but 6,000 times over, repeated until the air itself was filled with the sounds of butchery. The victims were raised, hoisted into the air to begin their slow, public descent into death. The mechanics of crucifixion were a medical masterpiece of torture. The nails driven through the wrists, or, as was common, ropes tied tightly, would press on or sever the median nerve, sending bolts of searing, relentless pain up the arms. Body's own weight became the instrument of suffocation. To exhale, the victim had to push up on the nail through their feet, an act of excruciating pain. Every breath was a choice, a desperate, agonizing struggle against the inevitable. Thirst would become an all-consuming obsession. The Italian sun would beat down, blistering the skin. The nights would bring a chilling cold, and through it all, consciousness would remain. A horrified prisoner in a cage of inescapable pain, mind forced to witness its own body's slow, systematic destruction. This was not a punishment hidden away in a dungeon. Every traveler on that road was a forced spectator. A family on an ox-drawn cart returning from market, a merchant with his precious wares, a powerful senator in his comfortable litter carried by slaves who dared not look up. All had to pass through this gallery of the damned. For weeks, the road to Rome was a symphony of suffering, a living, dying monument to the price of defiance. Each cross was a terrible, silent sermon on the futility of challenging Roman power. The message, delivered by Crassus and the Senate, was clear and unequivocal. This is what happens to those who dream of freedom. This is the fate of slaves who dare to call themselves men.
The 6,000 died. It may have taken days. When it was finally over, their bodies were left to rot on the crosses, a final, calculated insult. They were denied burial, left as a feast for wild animals and carrion birds, a lingering stench of death that hung over the road for months, a constant, putrid reminder of Roman justice. Crassus had his victory. He had crushed a rebellion and cemented his reputation for ruthless resolve. The specter of Spartacus's crucified army would haunt the Roman consciousness for a century. Future slave uprisings would be smaller, more desperate, crushed before they could ever gain such terrifying momentum. The warning had been heard. But in his desire to make an example, Crassus had made a terrible miscalculation. The rebellion was crushed, but the very act of its suppression gave it a terrible immortality. By making the punishment so absolute, so public, so horrifying, he ensured that the name of Spartacus and the dream he represented would never truly die. He intended to create a symbol of Roman power, but instead he created a martyr for all of history, a timeless symbol of the eternal struggle of the oppressed against their oppressors. Today, the ancient stones of the Appian Way still trace their path toward Rome. The crosses are long gone, turned to dust by the unceasing passage of centuries. The air is no longer filled with the sounds of agony, but with the hum of modern life. But the memory of that brutal lesson lingers, a silent, haunting testament to the brutal price of defying an empire and the enduring, tragic echo of a dream of freedom.